You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 354, Ratification Spring. Now, last time we covered the three New England states that considered ratification in early 1788. In that case, Connecticut backed it pretty overwhelmingly. Massachusetts backed it narrowly, with only 53% of delegates voting in favor. And to get to that majority, supporters had to back a series of suggested amendments. Since these were suggestions, they would not hold up the ratification process, but they legitimized some of the criticisms that later states would use against ratification. Rhode Island just flat out refused to hold a convention, and instead held a referendum in March of 1788, where the voters overwhelmingly rejected the Constitution. So, by the early spring of 1788, we had 6 states that supported the Constitution and 1 state against. Under the terms of the Constitution, once 9 states had ratified, the Constitution would go into effect. At that point, any dissenters or stragglers would be denied participation in the new Union. Other states were still moving along, just at their own pace. Now, before we continue into our discussions about ratification, I want to mention one other event that took place around this time, which has absolutely nothing to do with ratification. New Orleans was under the control of Spain at this time. Spanish officials considered the city critical as it controlled access to the Mississippi River. The river was critical to commerce and also operated as the border between the United States and Spanish territory. On Friday, March 21st, 1788, the Spanish royal treasurer was lighting candles on an altar in his home to commemorate Good Friday. The candles set the curtains on fire, and quickly the entire house was engulfed in flames. New Orleans consisted almost entirely of wooden buildings built close together with little thought given to fire prevention. Strong winds spread the fire across the city. It did not help that priests refused to allow the ringing of church bells as an alarm, since it was Good Friday and bell ringing was prohibited. By the time the fire was out, 80% of the city had been completely destroyed. It would take years for New Orleans to be rebuilt, but the rebuilding did result in many more brick and stone houses, as well as much more of a Spanish design in the city overall. So that was a big non-ratification story for 1788. I thought I'd at least mention it before we continue on with the ratification fight. So the next state that was up for ratification was Maryland. This was the last of the middle states to take up consideration. Maryland's governor, former Continental General William Smallwood, did not even present the Constitution to the legislature until the end of November 1787, more than 2 months after the Constitution had finished its business. Before calling for a convention, the Assembly asked the Maryland delegates who did attend the convention in Philadelphia to come testify before the Assembly. Maryland had sent 5 delegates to the convention, none of whom stayed for the whole thing. 3 delegates signed the final document. 2 others, Thomas Mercer and Luther Martin, left the convention early because they objected to what the convention was doing. Mercer did not appear before the Assembly, but Martin, who had been Maryland's Attorney General for many years and also served in the Confederation Congress before heading to the convention, had a great deal to say about it. Martin showed up to the convention in mid-June after the Philadelphia delegates had been debating for nearly a month. He was outraged, not only by the efforts to create such a strong national government, which would be dominated by the large states, but also by the decision to require all delegates to secrecy. The people of his home state had no idea that this convention was completely rewriting an entirely new constitution, and he was even prohibited from telling anyone. Martin ended up giving a lengthy negative report to the Assembly, much of which was later made into a pamphlet called Genuine Information, and distributed to further the Anti-Federalist cause. The 3 other delegates who favored ratification and who had signed the Constitution also gave their testimony before the Assembly. One of them even read Benjamin Franklin's speech for compromise into the record. Martin's opinions, however, carried great weight with many of the people in the state. Maryland had long been skeptical of central government. It had been the last state to ratify the Articles of Confederation, insisting that Virginia give up its western land claims before it even agreed to the Confederation. It saw its large neighbor to the south as a direct threat. The new Constitution's adoption of proportional representation in the House meant that Virginia would have far greater power in the new government. Now, that said, there was a sizable faction of Federalists in the Maryland government. They recognized the need for a more powerful federal government. In a relatively close vote on December 1st, the House of Delegates voted 28 to 22 to schedule the election of convention delegates 4 months later in April of 1788, with the convention to begin on April 21st, a couple weeks after that election. That gave the people nearly 5 months to debate the merits of the proposed Constitution. Newspapers and pamphlets from both sides flooded the state. The Federalists seemed to win a majority of delegates. The Anti-Federalists then developed a plan to end the convention without taking any vote on ratification. The argument was that they should wait until Virginia voted on the matter. The hope was that the delay might result in a greater change later down the road that would shut down the whole effort. The tactic ended up backfiring. When James Madison heard about the plan in Virginia, he wrote to George Washington urging him to weigh in on the matter. So the day before the convention was scheduled to begin, Washington wrote to Thomas Johnson, who was a Maryland federal delegate to the convention. Washington said that adjourning without a vote would be tantamount to a rejection, and made clear Washington's view that this would be a disaster. Maryland's leaders, like almost everyone in the country, greatly respected Washington's views, and when Johnson read Washington's letter to the convention, support for ratification grew even stronger. By the sixth day of the convention, April 26, 1788, the delegates voted overwhelmingly, 63 to 11, to ratify the new Constitution. Maryland was on board. Next up was South Carolina, which did not even begin to consider the Constitution until their state legislature met in January of 1788. When the new legislative session began, the Assembly voted to thank the 4 delegates who had attended the Philadelphia Convention. All 4 of those people were also members of the Assembly, and they insisted that they be allowed to testify. All 4 delegates did speak in favor of ratification. Other representatives, however, were opposed. Former Governor Rawlins Loudons, who was a senator at the time, took up the lead of the opposition. The opposition raised a lot of the same arguments we've heard in other states, such as the new government having too much power and that the convention exceeded its authority. They also feared northern domination in the new government and that southern interests in issues of commerce and foreign treaties would receive short shrift. They also objected to the fact that Congress could ban the slave trade after 20 years. The vast majority of legislatures in South Carolina believed that slavery was going to be critical to the state's future. The Federalist majority in South Carolina, however, stressed the benefits of union and stronger government. By this time, it was clear the Constitution was headed for adoption nationwide. South Carolina could not afford to be out on its own. Almost everyone also believed that the southern population would outstrip the North in the coming decades, so by the time Congress had the power to eliminate the slave trade, the South would have far more political power in the House of Representatives. Although the state was divided on the issue of ratification, there was not much debate about holding a convention. The Assembly voted unanimously to schedule the convention in May. The more contentious debate was over where to have it. The Federalists wanted the convention in Charleston, where a majority strongly favored the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists wanted the convention in the western part of the state, where opposition was stronger. In the end, Charleston won by a single vote. Several contemporaries expressed a belief that a majority of people in the state opposed ratification. The Federalists, though, still had one big advantage. Although the western counties were the center of opposition, the eastern districts were still greatly overrepresented in the legislature. These voting districts were used to pick the convention delegates, meaning that the Federalists in the east got more delegates than their population should have dictated. Following the elections in April, the Federalists had a clear majority of delegates. The convention met in Charleston beginning on May 12, 1788. 3 days later, they received word that Maryland had ratified. This only grew the momentum in favor of ratification. The opposition managed to get the convention to vote in favor of several recommended amendments. These included the right of states to set the date of elections, a declaration that the government powers were limited only to those expressly mentioned in the Constitution, and removing the power of the federal government to levy direct taxes. As we've seen in other states, though, these amendments were put forward as suggestions. They were not contingent on their ratification. The vote to ratify the Constitution unconditionally took place on May 23rd, with a vote of 149 to 73 in favor of ratification. That made South Carolina the 8th state to ratify. New Hampshire had hoped to be one of the early ratification states. The state had shown little enthusiasm for the convention itself. They ended up nominating 4 delegates to go to Philadelphia, but they refused to pay their travel expenses. As a result, only 2 delegates went, and they didn't arrive until July, about 2 months into the convention. Both delegates, however, did favor the final product and did sign the Constitution. A sizable majority in the state legislature appeared to favor the Constitution. Governor John Sullivan, also a former Continental general, also supported ratification. John Langdon, one of the leading proponents, wrote to George Washington in November of 1787 saying, quote, "I have not heard a single person object to the plan, and very few find fault even with a single sentence, but all express the greatest desire to have it established as soon as it may be." The governor called a special session of the legislature in December to set dates for the election of delegates. The assembly then scheduled a convention for mid-February 1788. Rather than simply hold statewide elections, New Hampshire allowed local towns to select their delegates at town meetings that were being held between late December and early February. New Hampshire was facing the same fights that were taking place all over New England at this time, and which had resulted in Shays' Rebellion in 1786 in Massachusetts. Like the Massachusetts farmers in Shays' Rebellion, the farmers in New Hampshire were also suffering under heavy debt and heavy taxes to pay off that war debt. Many of these farmers saw the new Constitution as an effort by the wealthy merchants to give themselves more power to tax and collect debts, thus destroying the farmers. John Langdon, who was the guy who told Washington he hadn't heard of a person who objected, apparently did not spend much time chatting with farmers in small towns across New Hampshire. All the state newspapers supported ratification, as did most of the state's ministers. The Anti-Federalists, however, organized and encouraged towns to send delegates to the convention to vote against ratification. These instructions, which were given to delegates, were mandatory, meaning even if the delegate was personally convinced that he should support ratification at the convention, he was still obliged to vote no. When the convention assembled in Exeter, delegates quickly realized that perhaps a quarter to a third of the delegates had instructions to vote no, and quite a few more were inclined to vote no. With the final result in doubt, the Federalists developed their own strategy. The first was to make sure that as many pro-ratification Federalists as possible were present on the first day of the convention, which was only about half the delegates that showed up on the first day, and 2/3 of them were committed Federalists. With this group, they voted a friendly chairman, Josiah Bartlett. Publicly, Bartlett was uncommitted, but Federalist leaders believed that they could count on him for decisions in their favor. They also adopted rules that no votes would be recorded other than the final ratification. That way, those who had instructions to vote no could vote freely on other matters without annoying their constituents. They also added a rule that a vote to adjourn would take precedence over any other motion. That way, if the vote looked like it was going to go the wrong way, they could just shut down the whole convention before they had a negative vote. Over the next few days, the delegates went through the Constitution, noting their objections. Many anti-federalists objected to the power of the Congress and the federal judiciary. They also railed against the terms of office. In New England, annual re-election was considered an important protection of representative government, so the Constitution's proposal to have 2-year terms in the House and 6-year terms in the Senate were simply unacceptable. Many also objected to the rule against any religious tests for elected office. New Hampshire had a rule that all elected officials must be Protestants, and that was considered a pretty fundamental requirement for good government. The Federalists managed to win over some delegates, but some of those that they won over were under instructions to vote no. Those counting heads realized that between those with instructions and those who chose to vote no, ratification would fail on an up or down vote. The Federalists managed to get some of the delegates under instructions to vote for adjournment. That way, they would have time to regroup and plan for another convention. The convention voted to adjourn by a vote of 56 to 51, without a vote on ratification. A part of the agreement to adjourn was to push back the next meeting until June, 4 months away. They also agreed to hold the convention in Concord, which was an area that had more opposition to the Constitution. This was a compromise they had to make to get the adjournment. But the delay gave Federalists more time to strategize on a plan that would get the Constitution ratified. They flooded the state with pro-ratification articles and pamphlets, emphasizing how the new Constitution would benefit everyone in New Hampshire. Many of these pamphlets also attacked anti-Federalists and their views, with being tied to the paper money riots that had plagued New Hampshire 2 years earlier. One of the most effective anti-Federalists who spoke at the convention in February was a lawyer named Joshua Atherton. In addition to some of the usual anti-Federalist arguments, Atherton also stressed the fact that the Constitution permitted the continued institution of slavery, which he strongly condemned. New Hampshire had become increasingly anti-slavery, although there actually were still a few slaves living in the state at the time. Atherton had opposed the adjournment in February and had wanted the convention to vote rejecting the Constitution. During this interim period following the adjournment, Federalists attacked Atherton personally, dredging up his Tory tendencies during the war. Atherton had kept a low profile during the war, believing that the Americans could never win. He also had associated himself with more outspoken Tories, but had never taken up the Loyalist cause actively. He had been detained briefly because of his Loyalist sympathies, but nothing ever really stuck to him during the war. Even so, Federalists accused him of wanting to keep the government weak so that Britain could someday retake the American colonies. The PR campaign had an impact, but it was not enough to really turn things around. Federalists also focused on town meetings to get more pro-ratification delegates, and also to try to reduce the number of instructions to vote no. They also tried to get some small towns that had not bothered to send a delegate to the February convention to send one to the June convention. This also helped, but it still was not clear that the state would have enough votes for ratification. So the Federalists tried another strategy. There were at least 24 delegates who supported ratification, but who were under instructions to vote no. The Federalists got these delegates to simply make themselves absent from the convention at the time of the final vote. This would reduce the numbers voting against ratification. When the convention met again on June 18, 1788, there was also another incentive. Since the last convention, Maryland and South Carolina had both ratified. That meant that the next state to ratify would be the 9th state, meaning they would have the honor of bringing the Constitution into effect. On that first day of the June convention, the Federalists counted 90 of 116 delegates present. 16 of those absent were delegates who were under instructions to vote no. After a few credential fights for some delegates, the Federalists hoped to get an up or down vote while the numbers favored them, but they waited until Friday, June 20th. A committee reported on 12 amendments, which were very similar to the ones that Massachusetts had recommended. Of those that were different from those recommended in Massachusetts, New Hampshire had one that prevented soldiers from being quartered in private homes. Another required a 3/4 vote of both houses to raise a standing army in times of peace. One barred Congress from laws, quote, touching religion or infringing on the rights of conscience. And finally, they wanted a prohibition on disarming any citizens unless they engaged in actual rebellion. Following the report on the amendments, Atherton made a motion to vote for conditional ratification. That is, New Hampshire would not support the Constitution unless and until these several amendments were added. Atherton's motion was seconded. The Federalists thought they had the votes to defeat, but they wanted to test that by calling for a vote to delay Atherton's motion until the next day. When that vote for delay passed, the Anti-Federalists realized that they were in the minority. Atherton then moved to adjourn, but he was voted down. The Federalists then moved to change the wording of Atherton's motion from conditional ratification to unconditional ratification. 4 other delegates who supported ratification but were under instructions to vote no then walked out of the convention. The final vote in favor of unconditional ratification was 57 to 47 in favor. Most were expecting a tight vote with a margin of maybe a couple of votes, so the 10-vote margin seemed to surprise everyone. With the 9th state having ratified, New Hampshire's results were reported to the Confederation Congress on July 2nd, and they began making plans to put the Constitution into effect. Now, of course, while technically in effect, there were still 2 very large and important states that had not ratified the Constitution, Virginia and New York. And next week, we're going to take a look at Virginia's ratification. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, Michael Mulhern, and Mitchell Anderson. Thanks also to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Patrick LeBeau, and Kurt Avard. I really do appreciate everyone who provides ongoing support for this podcast on Patreon or one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo. Because I've started doing this full-time, I've been able to produce a lot more bonus episodes, which I hope you're enjoying. I do not put any of my episodes behind a paywall so that everybody can enjoy them, and I really hope that if that means something to you, that you will help me out, even in a little way, by supporting me as an ongoing member on Patreon or a one-time gift. Now remember, if you do join on Patreon, even as a free member, you can get invitations to our live Zoom events, and if you pay as little as $2 a month, you get access to our commercial-free RSS feed of each episode, which you can either listen to online or through your favorite podcast program. If you are willing to support the show for at least $10 a month, you also get a new magnet every month with a different flag from the Revolutionary War. And I can tell you that some longer-term donors have built up some pretty amazing collections of Revolutionary War flag magnets. But thanks again to everyone who does provide support. I also want to remind everyone that we are getting into t-shirt weather now, and you can buy your American Revolution Podcast t-shirt. Just go to merch.amrevpodcast.com for more details. And that link is in the show notes, or if you go to the blog article, you can get it from there. This week, we covered the 9th state ratification of the Constitution. New Hampshire Federalists were eager to become the 9th state. In fact, when they actually held the vote on ratification at the convention on June 21st, 1788, the secretary was careful to mark down the time of the vote, 1 p.m., because delegates were aware that the Virginia convention was ongoing at the time, and they wanted to make sure that they got credit for being first if both states happened to vote on the same day. What really struck me was how close a vote it was and how many political games the New Hampshire folks had to play to get ratification done. Today, of course, we think of the Constitution as this great foundational document, but at the time of passing, it was very controversial. And as we'll see as we get later into the process, the more skeptical states showed a lot more opposition in these later ratification efforts. In fact, Maryland, which we discussed today, would be the last state to ratify without proposing any amendments to the new Constitution. And as we'll see, many of the later states were reluctant to join and perhaps only got to ratification since they knew the United States was being formed with or without them, and they decided it was better to be in than out. Now, we sometimes hear arguments today that perhaps some states should leave the Union and form separate countries based on political differences. I always find this bothersome since so many of our freedoms are based on our power as a country to keep other powers at bay. The U.S. has for so many generations been a strong regional power and even a superpower that I think we've forgotten how subject we could be to foreign interference if we were smaller and weaker as a country or countries. The founders at this time certainly had their differences with men in other regions, but they appreciated that unity was more critical than pushing on those differences. The United States was, and in my opinion still does, remain a critical goal of our country. Now, one thing that stood out to me at the conventions was the issue of slavery entering into the public conversation. I've stressed in earlier episodes that before the Revolutionary War began, slavery was just not that controversial. It was generally accepted as a part of life. Even the Quakers, who became one of the most forceful advocates for abolition, did not reach that conclusion until just a few years before the Revolutionary War began. The principles upon which the Revolution was won made slavery a controversy. It was completely at odds with the principles on which the United States was founded. I mentioned in the main episode that the Anti-Federalists in New Hampshire had used the toleration of slavery in the new Constitution as a reason to oppose it. That issue had also come up in Massachusetts, where advocates for ratification argued that the more powerful federal government would prove to be a, quote, mortal wound to slavery in the longer term. The issue of slavery also came up in South Carolina and Georgia, where Southern advocates feared that the lack of an explicit protection of slavery might take away a state's authority to permit the practice. Now, in hindsight, we all know that slavery became a huge flashpoint between the North and the South in the early 19th century, culminating in the Civil War. What we are seeing in these state debates in 1788 is really the beginning of that sectional divide. My book recommendation this week is The Constitution and the States, the Role of the Original 13 in the Framing and Adoption of the Federal Constitution, by Patrick Conley and John Kaminsky. Now, this book was published in 1988 as part of the bicentennial celebration of the Constitution. Each chapter of the book is written by a different expert and covers the ratification process in each of the 13 states. It gives the reader a look at the ratification process and how each state tackled it. Each chapter covering one state is about 20 pages, give or take. So along with the introduction to the book, it's about 300 pages long, not counting notes and index. If this sounds interesting, used copies are available for sale, but there's also a borrow-only copy which you can look at on archive.org. Just look for The Constitution and the States, the Role of the Original 13 in the Framing and Adoption of the Federal Constitution, by Patrick Conley and John Kaminsky. My online recommendation is a Maryland Law Review article called Luther Martin, Maryland and the Constitution, by William Reynolds. Martin, of course, was the lead anti-federalists in Maryland and also an outspoken opponent of the convention itself. There are lots of good articles to recommend about this debate. This is a good sample of someone who articulates some genuine concerns about the proposed Constitution. As always, I've included direct links on both my blog and website. My question this week asks, was the American War of Independence really about universal rights, as Thomas Paine claimed, or was it merely one more colonial revolt by the colony's elites? Well, I guess if the war was desired only by the colonial elites, it probably would have ended before it began. That's what officials in London had believed when they sent Thomas Gage in 1774 to arrest the troublemakers. Many royal governors had been telling officials in London that the unrest was really the result of a few bad apples, and that coming down hard on them would bring the colonies back in line, and that the vast majority of the population remained loyal and happy subjects. When Gage did try to arrest a few troublemakers, he found that thousands of farmers picked up their muskets in defense of those who were arrested. This was a widespread feeling among the colonists, even in 1774, before open warfare began. The colonists made clear that they were willing to defend their rights, with their lives if necessary, rather than live under a tyrannical government. And this brings me to another definitional issue. Many people think of tyranny as a government that rules by terror and leads to terrible conditions for the people. While such a government might meet that definition, the definition of tyranny is much broader. It refers to any government that rules by force rather than respecting the will of the people. When writers like Thomas Paine spoke of tyranny, they were not necessarily talking about horrific policies were being forced on them. They were talking about a government that did not respect the right of the people to have a say in those policies, whatever those policies were. Even a well-intentioned government that denied authority to elected leaders or that violated basic concepts of freedom like due process was going to be considered tyrannical, not because life was necessarily miserable, but because the government could make it miserable at any time and the people would be powerless to stop them. That was why all the colonists insisted on protecting their rights. The notion that there are basic rights which any government was bound to respect was a somewhat radical one at this time. Britain had respected certain rights for centuries, but many argued that those rights were a privilege of being an Englishman, not a fundamental and universal right. As the struggle grew prior to open warfare, colonists argued that there were fundamental rights which no legitimate government could ever ignore. If a government did so, it was tyrannical and should be overthrown. Since the rights under attack were felt by both colonial elites and commoners, all of them joined in this struggle for freedom. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me, either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.